Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. As we'd like to share our thoughts and insights and experience of doing business in Asia. This is a combination of my own experiences from over a decade of working on international projects and nearly 5 years on the ground in Asia, as well as experiences shared to me through our team at FAO Global and the partners we work with. Again, if you're not familiar with how to ask a question or using the chat function to ask questions, please play around with it, get familiar with it. Um, I'd like this to be as highly interactive as possible. I'd like to answer all of your individual questions. So please ask them. All right, so for those who do not know me, my name is Brandon Hughes. I'm the CEO and founder of FAO Global. I have over 10 years of working on international projects, both in Asia, Europe, and the United States for international companies or purposes. I've spent over 7 years in the US Army as both a planner and foreign relations expert. I've specialized now, our firms, in go-to-market strategies in the United States, and also China. Over the last 10 years, I spent at least 3 years living in China, 6 months in Thailand or more, 9 months in Afghanistan for the government doing international affairs, and probably 20 to 30 international trips of a week or two to Asia specifically. So my team has over 30, 35 years of experience living in Asia and managing projects. So we bring a lot to the table. I've also worked with 2 international think tanks, the Carnegie Endowment and Asia Society, and I have a master's in international relations from Tsinghua University in Beijing. And I'm doing my executive MBA with Columbia University right now on international finance. All right, so just again, to kind of frame where we're coming from, I started FAO Global a couple of years ago. We're an international consulting firm that leverages a network of over 100 industry professionals around the world to facilitate projects, conduct market entry, due diligence, and market expansion. So over the last 3 years, this is the framework where I'm coming from and the most recent experiences. But again, we bring a lot of different experiences that we're going to share with you today. So to kick it off, and again, please, ask your questions as they come up. This presentation is meant to be a quick introduction to doing business in Asia, but we'd love to hear your questions as well. So, for many of you, if you haven't been to Asia or you have, it's very clear that there's a lot of differences in both languages, culture, economic environments. The UN recognizes 48 countries. There's hundreds of dialects, and there's so many different ways of doing things. Even in a small country, from north to south, east to west, there's drastic differences. You see differences in the range of greetings, business culture, ways you can do marketing, laws and regulations, mobile phone usage, banking practices, and everything to government influence as well. Something we also see, there's varying degrees of infrastructure as well. For example, in Myanmar, it's an amazing country, a lot of potential, but outside of the main cities, there's very little infrastructure development. So when you compare an emerging market to, say, that of China, which has a wonderful ecosystem of infrastructure and logistics and supply chain already developed, you start to see these drastic differences between countries. Same thing in Thailand, same thing in Vietnam. Even in China, the East Coast, the Eastern Seaboard, which is the bulk of the economic development, is so drastically different than those of cities even just a couple hours inland. So when you're talking about doing business in Asia, you really have to approach each area and each country, each region, each locality very individually. Another example, in Indonesia right now, they're seeing a tech and industry boom. Chinese companies are already shifting manufacturing to those areas, yet US companies are still relying on the Chinese ecosystem. In Vietnam, you have an alternative workforce, but you have very limited capacity to fulfill global orders. And then finally, you have to understand the different geopolitical risk and country risk that comes along with it. In 2008, for example, when I was in Thailand, I got a chance to witness the massive red shirt, yellow shirt riots, which is essentially the countryside, the citizens of the countryside, disputing the citizens of Bangkok to a large extent, and there's a lot of political turmoil, economic repercussions because of that. In China, many major cities are shifting, and many foreigners are leaving. The expat community is greatly dwindled, and there's a lot of complaints with the standard of living and lifestyle right now because of how it was 10 years ago when I was living there full time and what it is today. And this is not good or bad, it's just difference, and understanding how these differences and shifts are coming together is important. One of the things that's very important, and we bring this slide up to just kind of highlight all the different things that are involved in building a relationship abroad. But if you do not have a team that lives full-time in Asia, or you don't travel there often, and even if you do travel there often, you still are missing critical pieces of information about the environment, local climate, politics, that make a big difference. For example, when I had taken a break from going to China for a couple of years, and when I came back, all of a sudden, the whole way of doing business had changed. WeChat was introduced. When I had lived in China, there was no WeChat. Everything, the way things were the way things were being implemented, the laws that were enacted, the enforcement mechanisms, so much had changed that it took me a couple weeks to kind of get back into the flow of things. Now, for me, I had lived there so many years that I understood the underlying culture, but it took a little bit to, come up. And so, if you don't travel abroad, all the time, you do have to, find yourself relying on these subject matter experts that do stay in country. And any sort of trip or business that you're planning on doing, it's not enough to have somebody who speaks the language anymore. We see, living in Washington, D.C., we see tons of people that speak perfect Chinese but have no idea how, the Chinese culture is or how to do business there, and because they just never traveled. They're book smart but not street smart, and you really need a mixture of both. I wanted to highlight we've gone to great lengths to kind of learn different parts of the culture. Even on our last trip, we ended up doing a series of, I'm trying to circle it, but the horse in, the series, we've done a series of business meetings on horses, and that was something that was very important to the people that we were doing business with. So, it means a lot to understand, the culture that you're working with, and there's always a learning curve. So a couple things, you want to also make sure you assess the market risks. There are varying levels of risks. Many can be mitigated simply by understanding the environment and planning accordingly. Many large corporations have come under fire recently, and a lot of them is due to not understanding the culture, not having a good process for implementing marketing campaigns, or being sensitive to political issues. So for example, recently, and there's a photo of it on the bottom right of the Hong Kong protests, which again, I was able to see firsthand on a variety of trips over the last year. But a lot of businesses, Western businesses, have been hurt because of the backlash and unintended backlash from a lot of these events. For example, many Dolce & Gabbana, well, we'll get to that in a second, but Versace, many airlines had listed Hong Kong as a separate entity than China. Hong Kong is a special administrative region, an SAR, but previously Hong Kong, when it came to all sorts of as far as how it was referred to in travel, it would always be Hong Kong, Hong Kong, and Macau would be Macau, Macau. Just like you have Beijing, China, Hong Kong, Hong Kong was completely separate as far as travel goes, or when you look on a company's website. So a lot of airlines, a lot of companies have come under fire over those type of differences because Hong Kong is, a special administrative region of China, but a lot of people didn't make sure to update their websites, or certain people had different perceptions of it, and this caused serious economic risk to these companies that didn't change, or they got caught up in this public fervor of anti-corporation sentiment that can extrapolate and scale much faster than most Western business have. Also, when it comes to the different types of market risks, I think COVID-19, the coronavirus, and the US-China trade war have highlighted the risk that only comes from working in one single industry cluster or from one single market. So when you're looking at building a supply chain or doing business, understand that certain situations can cut off that entire market for you. And as we see, that just disrupts the entire global supply chain when it does. And the last thing too is also differing levels on rule of law, different ways to interpret it, different ways to even register trademarks, sue somebody, different enforcement mechanisms. All of these are different depending on what country you're in and also what province you're in. For example, in China, if you're talking IP protection, that may be much stronger in Shanghai than it is in a smaller city, let's say of 5 million people, because maybe that cop or that enforcement agency feels like that's not worth their time to try and enforce, versus someone in Shanghai who has much more incentive to and much more political pressure to enforce that type of ruling. Also, when you're building relationships with Asian counterparts, it's very important that you be respectful of differences, but also be yourself. We've seen time and time again how somebody, will try to emulate and be more like their counterparts across the table. For example, my counterparts don't need me to be Asian. They need me to be American. They need me to be myself. But if I try to be someone that I'm not, they would see that, and then I might lose trust. It wouldn't come off as genuine. And as a foreigner, a lot of times they don't expect you to speak perfect. I speak Chinese, but I'm not perfect at it, and I'm not expected to be perfect at it. Everyone has a little bit different expectations depending on their perception of you. There's also stereotypes, in Asian countries towards Westerners or foreigners, or if you're from Africa or South America, everybody has these. And until they meet you and get to know you, a lot of times they're basing their initial impressions off of this. So, understand what they're likely going to think about first. And you can talk to people in your area as well to kind of get an idea of how people are going to perceive you, and then use that to your advantage. Figure out ways to address these concerns before it becomes an issue, or so it doesn't create an issue. There's also different ways to, build relationships. In China, drinking baijiu and motai at dinner is a common business practice. Some countries have different stigmas against drinking, during dinner. In Myanmar, we had dinner at a very Western place, and it was almost like being back in the US. But sometimes we might also do a dinner or a lunch on a street corner. So there's different ways to build this relationship. In Japan, it's going to be different than in China and in Thailand, in Vietnam. So be patient, understand what your counterpart is likely thinking. You also want to understand what their motivations are, what their constraints are, and also what their daily situation is like. For example, if you are negotiating a contract and you are essentially trying to nitpick certain little aspects to your counterpart across the table, these are unrealistic, or it's not a big deal to them. Understanding what they think and how they view certain aspects of a contract or negotiation or an agreement is very important. You also want, there's been so many examples of major corporations that have failed in China. They have failed in Thailand because the management teams just don't understand their counterparts. And this goes both ways. For example, if a contract says management will, or their teams will only work 40 hours, and you have the management in the US only working 40 hours, maybe 45, but the Chinese side works 60 or 80, there's going to be a conflict. Even though the contract only says 40, the different attitudes towards how this contract is interpreted, what aspects are important to follow and what are not, make a difference. And a lot of times these can be avoided or mitigated, but again, it takes that consistent learning about each other and understanding to, work through these problems or work through these challenges, we'll say. There's all the different, every country has different cultural norms. One thing that's pretty universal is be respectful, be patient. A lot of times business is not done in the very first meeting. Sometimes it's not done on the first business trip. That's okay. Just understand that and come to expect that. Have a plan in place for that. And one thing that is, especially if you're not Asian or have an Asian background, is that you still want to show that you're trying to learn about your counterpart, and also you're trying to work with them. I think the takeaway for me from a decade of doing this is that as long as you're trying to work through a problem and genuine about that, then everything will work out. Another aspect, to consider, well, especially when you have a business or have operations abroad, you want to conduct thorough due diligence. This means understanding your partner, understanding their motivations, understanding their intentions. This also helps you understand your risk exposure. You can check public records, private records. China has a social credit system now, and you're able to check that. Different areas, you can do different background checks. You can leverage a wide variety of resources to include the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You have companies like ours that can do it, but you want to do a thorough check of your counterparts' private and public presence, because you might find something, whether it's a influential relationship you didn't know about, or they're involved in a competitor's company. These are important. Also, one thing that's unique about doing business abroad is that there's a lot of middlemen involved. A lot of times a factory, for example, they may not have anyone on staff that can speak English, so they hire another firm, or another firm reaches out to them to say, hey, we can sell this abroad for you. And so after, very quickly, you can have multiple layers of middlemen before ever reaching the final seller or the final buyer. This is very important because sometimes even if you order direct from a factory, that might not actually be the factory that's actually making the product. So understand that, conduct thorough due diligence, visit the factories, talk to the people, leverage experts that are in country that have worked through these things before. Also, sometimes there's differences between your accounting. Sometimes, and this has happened quite often, but it's not for everyone, but there's actual books and then books that they share with foreigners. And this might be because they changed the language, they massaged the numbers. There's a wide variety of ways. So if you're only seeing one set of books that was prepared for you, you want to bring in some sort of a local auditor, or be able to kind of understand and work through that kind of middle ground, or read between the lines, because a lot of times the health of a company and the way and the transparency in different companies in different regions varies greatly. In Mongolia recently, we were able to see the books of a lot of different companies, whereas if we did the same type of thing in China, it would take a lot more to actually get to that level of detail. And lastly, again, I can't say this enough, leverage local people with industry knowledge. Just because you have an industry expert in the US, it doesn't mean that they're going to understand how to understand or how to interpret what they see in a foreign establishment. And this doesn't mean that they're not going to find things or have their own opinions, but again, using someone that has lived there and worked in those environments, they're going to notice things that are different that you may not notice because you're used to a Western setting. One thing that is very, very important is understanding geopolitical impacts as well as geopolitical risk. So, one thing, for example, this is what I share with all my analysts to kind of get them thinking the bigger picture. If North Korea shoots off a missile, what does this mean for commerce? A lot of people will try to give a very broad answer, but you really have to think, especially in our line of business, how does that impact your ability to do business in the region? Does your shipping lanes get cut? Does that increase prices on your cargo? Are there more if you're a supplier or a logistics provider, does that increase port fees? Does that increase waiting time? Does that increase fuel costs? So there is every major incident, there is a chain repercussion, a chain of events and a chain of repercussions. In Hong Kong and Taiwan issues with China, you had and also with culture, Dolce & Gabbana, they had a very culturally insensitive ad placed last year, or I believe it was late 2018. And they essentially, in 10 days, they had 17,000 sales channels shut off overnight. And they are still trying to claw back their market presence in the region, just because it was a culturally insensitive ad. And then also the response was not acceptable. Same thing with airlines, and you have a lot of major companies that have faced this, not just the ones listed. You also have historic tensions. There's during World War II, there was a lot of political, cultural, things that came up. Japan invaded a lot of the countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and so there's historical animosity towards that. Does that mean that it's going to manifest into negative business? Maybe, maybe not, but you should be aware of that. Same thing with China and India, Vietnam and China. There's a lot of historic mistrust in the region, and just because there's business being conducted doesn't mean that could change or that couldn't change. And things shift very rapidly when they do. So just being aware of these, understanding what you see in the news, how it may impact a response from another country. And also, I think, again, COVID-19 and the trade war has highlighted reliance on a single industry or a single region. So for those who are doing business in China, now is a great time to reevaluate your supply chain. Look at alternative markets for production or sales. And then again, we talked on IP protection. So there's a lot that geopolitics does impact when you're doing business in Asia. And it's the same in the US, but I think you feel it more in emerging markets. So, we're to really sum all this up, when you're planning and preparing, at some point you're going to have to do a business trip out there. Maybe you've done it before, but we're talking a dedicated trip to really build out your connections, your presence abroad. One thing you want to do is choose the right people. You want to make sure that they are very culturally aware, not only of themselves, but their surroundings. Empathy goes a long way with working in Asia. You always want to have somebody that is outgoing but respectful, not boisterous, but the ability to break through language or cultural gaps and really build a relationship. I think one of the benefits to me, or that I've seen, is that anyone who starts a conversation off with a smile or a happy presence or face really breaks down a lot of barriers, because people are very cautious, and especially when it comes to international business, people don't want to lose money. They don't want to get taken advantage of. So just bringing in a more a lighter presence to the meeting is helpful. You also want to make sure that you have your marketing materials prepared, they're translated. You want to have an ability for that, the people you meet to actually contact you. A lot of them use social media. You want to make sure that your website is not blocked or your domain name is not blocked where your email goes to. So having these alternate forms of communication is critical. You want to make sure you practice small talk. Again, you may go into a meeting and they may not want to talk about business right away. It may be later at dinner. It may be the next day. So you want to be able to understand a little bit and be prepared to answer personal questions, talk about your family, and have a list of general topics that you can discuss. You also, when you go abroad, you don't want to waste any time. So you want to make sure that you pre-coordinate a lot of meetings, but add in some flexibility so that you can meet new people, take them out, have a meeting with them later as well. We always recommend meeting with some sort of a local expert, again, either consulting company or a lawyer, chamber of commerce, embassy official. You really want to get a non-biased view of the land as it sits today, of the environment. And then lastly, you don't learn the culture or your market by business meetings. You learn it by being involved, by enjoying and testing and tasting the local cuisine, seeing local sites, going to a mall, seeing how people act, seeing how they buy things. Just, you need to experience and immerse yourself in the local markets as best you can. And in a day or two is not going to make you an expert. It takes years to develop this, but it gives you a better understanding than most people would if they just stuck to business meetings and then flew home. And so, again, where your company needs help with any of this stuff, that's really concludes our presentation today. And again, I just wanted to make sure that this was an open conversation. If you have any questions, if you have questions about Western people as well, if you're joining us from Asia, please feel free to ask whatever you want. Here's a list of services and how we support businesses abroad. We've done business all over the world, so we're happy to help. And if you have any questions, we always take ideas on topics. Please send them to info@faoglobal.com. Visit our website. We are on all social media, so please send us a message. And again, if you have any questions about this as well, we're really happy to answer them for you, even if it's specific to your business.